Hey everybody, Codemaster X here, back with another video. This is the C# Basics class. In the last one, we talked about logic and code flow, which basically means, where the code's going to go and that sort of thing. So where it goes from and to, and how to create a little game that basically says, is our number higher or lower? And then when we get it, it says you win. So reminder of the code there, and then we're going to move on. This video is going to be on scopes, code flow, and functions, and so we're going to talk about how all of that works here and now. So all right, so let's talk about scope. Scope is incredibly important because it essentially defines where things are and are not accessible from. So in the first video, we talked about creating variables and using variables. And in the second video, we talked about how to do logic off of our variables. And in this video, we're going to be talking a bit about where are our variables accessible from? Can I just use a variable anywhere? The answer is no. And that's where scope comes in. So in a C# application, in this program file, if we do something here, this is called the global scope. So if I create a variable here, so if I say name, string name equals Mr. Code X, then this is accessible anywhere in this file. If I create a new function, well, let's talk about function. Functions are great. It's essentially like a macro. So it's basically a way of creating a one word, well, it could be more than one word, but it's basically a way of assigning a ton of actions to a simple phrase that allows you to then execute that code over and over again, so you don't have to rewrite it over and over and over again. So for instance, if we want to do the try parse thing, you know what, that's a great idea here. So let's go ahead and go back to this code, and we're going to create some functions around this code to explain how this works. So again, this is our global scope up here. Right, and we're going to create a new function down here. We're going to return a string. So every function has a return type that is essentially what data are we going to be returning from this function, if any. If we're not returning anything, then our function is going to return void. If we are going to be returning something, then our function needs to return the type of data that it's going to be returning. In this instance, we're returning a string. So let's say parse value as int, string value, and so the way that this works is that these are called parameters. This is data that we're passing into our function. So the question is, how do we use this now? So we have our try parse here. So instead of having all of this code and having to like redo that, we can do this, and we'll say int return value equals 0. Then we're going to out our return value, and then we return our return value. Oops, sorry, we're returning an int, not a string. So we're passing in value. We're passing out an integer. Our name is parse value as int. we're passing in a string called value. And so we're creating a variable here because we need it for our out. Remember, we can't use a variable until it's been defined. And we did that here, remember, with guess. And we needed to define guess here. To use an out here, we had to define our variables, so that's what we're doing. Then we're going to be using our try parse. In this instance, we're foregoing the if statement, which means that our number is, if it fails, it's always going to return 0, right? And then we're returning our value. So now we can say parse value as int. The reason that we're not, there we go. The reason that we weren't able to do that is because I had an extra ending curly brace there. We need to make sure we remove that. So you need to make sure if you have an open curly brace, it always has a matching closing curly brace. And you want to make sure that you don't have too many closing curly braces, or that can also cause a problem. They need to match up 1-to-1. So now we need to pass our value into parse value as int, and we'll do console.read line, and that's the value that we're going to pass in, and it's going to say cannot implicitly convert type int to bool. Well, we don't need this anymore because we're doing all of that stuff in here. So instead of that, we can just set guess equal to our read line, right? And then we can say if try parse, and we're going to be doing what's called the not flag, which is a exclamation point. So we're going to say if try parse returns false, then we're going to say please input a valid number between 1 and 10. And so now you see our code is actually a tiny bit smaller because of the fact that we converted that code into a function. And we can use that function as many times as we want. And it will always do the same thing. So the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to take our game and put it into a function as well. We're going to say void run game. We're not going to pass any variables into it because we actually don't need to. But we do actually need to call run game, because if I do this without calling it, it just says you win, right? It doesn't actually run the game. It just immediately says you win. But now if I run game, so I'm calling my run game function, now it actually goes into the game where we guess a number. So you can see how functions essentially, they don't execute unless you call them, right? So functions are a macro to a set of code, but you actually have to call that macro. The same way that works on your keyboard. So if you have a series of key presses that you've turned into a macro on your keyboard, they don't do anything until you press that macro key, right? Same way for functions. Functions are basically macros for code. And you could pass things into functions. Well, let's do something crazy. And so we're going to say string user input equals this. And we're actually going to put this inside of our run game. Right? And we're going to say console.readline. Then we're gonna put our read line, or our user input, into parse value as int. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to show you guys something about scope and how scope works. Remember how I mentioned that the global scope is basically up here, right? Well, functions, when you create functions, get their own scope. And so you're allowed to go from parent to child, but you can never go from child to parent or from child to child. And I'll demonstrate that here in a second. So we have our user input here. So can I just get rid of this? And instead of passing the value, I say user input. Well, we can see it's red and it says cannot resolve symbol user input. Why can't I do that? I've defined it up here, right? Well, I define that within the run game scope, and the run game scope is different from that. How would I get access to this? Well, I can either pass it in like I was before, having string value, or I can move this variable up into a higher scope. Right? And so if I put it up here, now all of a sudden, that is no longer red, and we can use it. That is how scope works. We defined it in run game, so we can't go back upwards, and we can't access it from our child scopes either. So we have two child scopes, run game and parse value as int. It's almost always better to pass data into a function like we were before, where we had string value, than to access a variable outside of the scope. This technically, the way that we're doing it now, is a bit more optimal because we're using less code. We don't have to pass this in here. But this is a very specific example where that's okay. It's almost always better to do it where you're passing the variable in rather than accessing it from the global scope, for a number of reasons. It's actually much better if we actually move everything out of the global scope, and everything is contained in scopes. So now our these variables are only accessible within run game, and we're passing only the data into parse value as int that is needed. The reason that this is a good thing is for a couple of reasons. Number one, it helps other programmers understand that you don't want this data being accessed from certain parts of your code for a various number of reasons, right? Some of those could be security. So if someone hacks the application, they may not have access to scopes that are lower than the global scope. It could be that there's some user input that's happening, and you don't want them to be able to jump out of that, scope and access global variables, all that kind of stuff. So it's almost always better to have the code be where you're using it, and then if you need to pass it in and do something to it, you pass that in, and then you pass out the result of that, just like we're doing with this parse value as int, where we're passing in our user input and we're getting our guess back out of it. So that is essentially, how that works. And so our program flow starts in the global scope, then we're calling run game, so we go into the run game, right? Then we hit our while, and that's going to continually run until guess is equal to answer, and then we jump scope here into our parse value as int, run this code, then we jump back out and continue here, and we jump back up to the top unless it's, unless those are equal. So that's kind of how the code flows through our program. These functions are incredibly they're incredibly important for not having to rewrite your code, and also for making sure that your code is contained in chunks where it's not accessible to people from the outside, so they can't just read answer. They have to go into the run game scope and then be able to read answer. Obviously there's ways around that. Hackers can do just about anything these days, but there's a number of reasons why you would want to keep everything separate. So yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed it. This one was a little bit faster than the other one. Functions aren't really a hard concept. They get harder as things go along, and things are going to become pretty difficult in the next section. We're going to be mixing functions with object-oriented programming, and we're going to learn how classes work and how inheritance works. And that's going to be a pretty large topic. So that's going to be a pretty long video. So we're going to end this one here for now. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace, peace.